Well, thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nicholas Herodotou. I'm a senior palliative medicine physician. So I have some experience in dealing with death and dying, since they jokingly call me Dr. Death in the hospital because I'm forever telling people that patient's dying. Now, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I'm fundamentally against this bill being passed and why I believe it should never be passed. 3 reasons: moral, social, and ethical. And I'll explain those 3. The first one, moral. Every society in the world has a law against murder. Regardless of what religious background they're from, there's no country that we know of that has a law that encourages unlawful killing. That's because every human being has an innate worth in their life. We are not animals. So one of the arguments people espouse, there are only 2 arguments for assisted dying, by the way. The first one is, you wouldn't let a dog suffer, would you? I'm sorry to tell you, we're not animals. Why? Even Hippocrates, the pagan, who was the father, really, of modern medicine, one of his criteria was, do no harm. And that's a very important point, that each one of us have a sense of purpose and value. Life is precious. Death, unfortunately, is an aversion to life. It's an aberrant. You know, to lose your loved one is an affront to living. So life itself is what has dignity and what is precious. Secondly, the idea of a social argument. The reason I'm talking about this is that no one lives in a vacuum. If you choose, God forbid, to take your life and you live on a desert island with no family, the consequences to what you do has no impact on anybody else. Unfortunately, we live in a society where what one person does can have serious repercussions to those around you. Let me give you an example. If you say today, I've got autonomy, and this is the one main argument they try to use for assisted dying, my right to die. Well, let me say, if you say tonight, oh, I want to drive on the opposite side of the M25 because that's my liberty. Well, you may choose to drive on the opposite side of the M25 because you want to express your autonomy, but the consequences, unfortunately, would be, number 1, you're probably going to die. Number 2, you're probably going to kill other innocent people on the road at the same time. So one's autonomy does not equate to you doing what you want, regardless, because we live in a society where we must be careful what we legislate for. Because if the legislation causes more damage to other people, then that's not a good law. That's why I'm fundamentally against this idea of freedom. I want to give you a quote from the Times newspaper in 2018. This lady, unfortunately, lost her daughter at 18 years of age from an awful cancer. And in this article in the Times newspaper in 2018, she says, I dealt with my daughter's death with cancer because she had great palliative care. I held her hand. I said goodbye. I had love, and I felt at peace because I did my best for my daughter. But her husband, who was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, actually went off to Switzerland to be euthanized, and she was actually angry. Let me just quote this small point from her. And the man was Simon Pinner, who actually killed himself in 2016. This is what she says about her husband's assisted suicide. The abrupt nature of her husband's death had left her fuming. I'm quoting from the Times. But surely it is equally brave to live with an illness, a disability, to embrace vulnerability, and to accept that none of us really has that much control. So that's the second point. And lastly, the idea of ethical. Thank you. What do I mean by ethical? Isn't that the same as moral? On the contrary, myself as a palliative medicine physician and the palliative care team, we give true dignity in dying. Shall I tell you why? It's not dignity in dying. They used to be called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. Did you know that? They changed their label. It's basically a chameleon. It just changes its color. Their agenda is still to open the door to everybody else, because you can't, for example, have autonomy just for terminally ill people. And what does it mean, being in the last 6 months of life? I spend most of my days given a prognosis. If you've got a dementia, when are you going to work out they're in the last 6 months of their life? Or you've got a chronic lung disease or chronic heart disease, It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. But in ethical terms, I spend the majority of my time in a hospital stopping futile medical treatments where we cause unbearable suffering to our patients. And that's why I'm talking about proper dignity in the natural end of a person's life. Let me give you one example of a patient I had. This man was in his 60s. He was married with a son who didn't have cancer, but he had awful, multiple complications of medical illness. He was so ill, he was on a drip, he was artificially fed, and he had the biggest bag I'd ever seen on his tummy, where he's draining over 2.5 liters a day of fluid coming out of a hole in his tummy. And he was so ill. Do you know what he kept saying to the doctors? Please let me die. He repeated it. They couldn't control the artificial feeding because it was making his kidney function worse. So they actually asked me to give an opinion. They wanted me to control his symptoms. The first thing I said to this gentleman, I said, sir, you have a legal right under UK law, providing you're not deemed to be mentally ill, to have all your treatments stopped so that you can die with dignity. He opened his eyes and he nearly cried. He said, you're the first doctor that's ever listened to me. So what I did is I got a psychiatrist to assess him, who agreed that he was depressed, but he had insight into the repercussions to stopping his artificial feeding. He was peg-fed. And we called the wife in, and we stopped the artificial feeding and sent him to a hospice, and he died within 5 days. But what was so moving is that he held his wife's hand. They were crying, and I was there with them. And there was a sense of peace because this man was so ill, he would never recover from his condition. He died with dignity. That's why this bill should never be legalized. Thank you for listening. I'm sure. Okay. Okay, so in answer to your question, first of all, I think the law as it is actually extremely good because it has safety netting. When you talk about this bill having so-called 2 doctors and a judge, I'd be interested to know where you're going to get these 2 doctors from. I mean, the people trying to see their GP have to wait weeks. So how on earth are you going to extrapolate 2 doctors out of nowhere? Oh, please come and assess this patient for assisted dying. And, oh, we need a judge. Well, there's a huge backlog, isn't there, in the courts? I mean, isn't it sort of 1 to 2 years before they see a judge? So how are we going to then pick up a judge to come and give an assessment? This is really utterly nonsensical. We have a good law. Why change a law that protects the vulnerable? This law will not protect the vulnerable. It will make them more vulnerable.
Their knowledge, if it might distress them. If you don't think this is true, it's up there on the NHS website for anyone to see. I feel like that's a proper parallel because it shows you how something will work in our own NHS. And I'm very concerned that it could happen to us. There are hundreds of other reasons that I'm against it, but that's a strong enough one on its own for me.
Can I just quickly answer that question for you? Because there's a big misunderstanding about DNA CPR or do not attempt resuscitation. First and foremost, it is a medically led decision. It's what a clinician does. So if I'm asked to see a patient, I will have that conversation with the patient and give the reasons why we're not going to do it. By default, everybody is for resuscitation. That means if your heart stops working or your lungs stop working, they would, if you like, jump on you and try to bring you back. If somebody has an advanced, incurable, progressive condition where the chance of them recovering is going to be virtually 0, you do not want to inflict, for example, an elderly dementia patient who is very frail and she has a cardiac arrest, and that DNAR form is not signed, the medical teams on call will jump on that person. So if that's your frail grandmother, they're going to jump on her, probably break her ribs, and make her into a worse state. That's why we sign it. It's nothing to do with accelerating people's death. It's a clear medical decision. The family can ask for a second opinion legally. They cannot legally refuse it. You can legally refuse a treatment, but you can't demand a treatment that's deemed not in their best interests. So they will often ask for a second opinion, so they will get me to come along and say, I completely agree. It's inappropriate because to inflict an added procedure that will cause more suffering than good, you don't do that. That's bad medical practice. And in countries where they don't sign do not resuscitate forms, they will literally treat them to death. unfortunately. And I'm really sorry to hear about perhaps the bad care your mother got and they didn't explain it clearly to you. It's very important it's explained to the patient and the family why they're signing it.